Hi, my name is Jenny, and I did my intellectual biography on Sigmund Freud. So, some biological information about Sigmund Freud. He was born in 1856 in a country called Moravia to Jewish parents, but not long after he was born, they moved to Vienna in Austria in 1860. So, he was about 4 years old. Um, very later in life, Freud left for England in 1938, and this was because since Freud was born to Jewish parents, he was Jewish, um, and the Nazis were invading Austria, and they were a massive threat, obviously. So he moved to England, but not long after he moved to England, Freud actually passed away from a morphine overdose, and this morphine overdose was quite interestingly commissioned by Freud, because Freud had cancer of the eye socket in the jaw, and he just wanted to be, so to say, put out of his misery. So he commissioned a morphine overdose given to him by one of his friends. So, just some basic information about his education. In 1873, he enrolled in medical school in Vienna, and he worked for about 6 years under a very influential person in Freud's career, Ernest Bruck. He graduated in 1881 with a medical degree, and in 1885, he traveled to Paris and continued to work and further educate himself. And when he went to Paris, he actually got his attention caught by this guy named Jean Charcot. Um, so Freud only spent about a year in Paris, but he got very intrigued by Jean's work. Charcot worked a lot with hypnosis and how hypnosis can treat hysteria, and hysteria is just like anxiety, essentially to the point where you have hallucinations or convulsions and paranoia. And Charcot actually inspired Freud to work with hypnosis in a form to address the subconscious, as Freud was very interested in addressing the subconscious. After Freud got back from Paris and working in Paris, he collaborated with a guy named Joseph Breuer. Joseph Breuer was his first and most important partner in research, almost. Joseph Breuer was one of the most influential people in developing Freud's psychoanalytic procedure, and psychoanalysis is essentially the stereotypical version of therapy where the patient sits and talks uninhibitedly about what's hindering them, what's not hindering them, just talks as a way to get into the subconscious. And one of the first cases of them testing psychoanalytic procedure is the Anna O case. The Anna O case is essentially this woman, they're using a pseudonym for her. This woman had terrible, terrible hysteria, and they just got her to talk and talk and talk until they discovered the root of her hysteria, which happened to be a dog, which I think is a little funny. But after this case, Freud and Joseph published the book Studies in Hysteria, which kind of set out the foundation for psychoanalytic procedure. However, after this, Freud and Breuer kind of had a falling out. Freud put a lot of emphasis onto the sexual origins of trauma. He thought that most traumatic feelings or traumatic events had a sexual origin, which is something Breuer just did not agree with. And because of this irreconcilable difference, Breuer and Freud went their separate ways and continued developing their own theories and ideas. Some influences on Freud were the scientific time period, Ernest Bruch, one of Freud's early professors and teachers, and then just really the science of physics. We'll get into those in a second. The scientific period. So Freud lived in a fairly contemporary scientific period. They were very modern. One of the most important scientific figures during this time and during Freud's childhood was Charles Darwin. Darwin's influence on science and like the animal kingdom changed how humans and animals were seen as scientific beings. Darwin's influence helped people consider people as something that is able to be studied. And less their own entity, they were considered more to be part of the hierarchical form of the animal kingdom. And so they were less their own all-powerful entity and more just something in the food chain, which helped for self-observation for the development of psychology and for other people to observe like things like the Anna O case where they're studying people to help people. Ernest Bruch was one of Freud's professors at the University of Vienna, where Freud got his medical degree. Freud adopted Bruch's idea of dynamic physiology. And dynamic physiology is essentially people and animals are energy and matter, and the theories of the conservation of energy and matter apply to people, which this theory helped Freud develop his theory of psychic energy, which is people have energy like just within them, and this energy can't be created nor destroyed. So it's always there, it's just manifesting itself in different ways. And the psychic energy is one of the very cornerstones of Freud's psychoanalytic theory because it is representative of the energy and the different dispersions of energy that one can have. Now we'll get into some Freud's work. This is a quote that I thought really showed like the basics of psychoanalysis. It says, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." This really is just a very, very simple, very easy way to understand what psychoanalysis is. And I think a good example of this is the Anna O case, where she just repressed her anxiety so much that she started having hysteria and paranoia and convulsions. So psychoanalysis is essentially the basic, most stereotypical version of therapy that most people will recognize. You'll picture the patient laying on a couch and the psychoanalytic person taking notes. And that's just because psychoanalysis is very simple, where the patient just speaks in order to tap into the unconscious based on their wording, or they just say whatever comes to mind. And at first, this theory really wasn't received very well. It wasn't until about 1908 when the first International Psychoanalytic Congress was formed that Freud's theories were really recognized as theories that are recognizable or capable of being something important. After the Psychoanalytic Congress, Freud got invited to give lectures in America and various countries where Freud's influence really started to grow. Another thing that is very popular that a lot of people know that Freud theorized is the tripartite, which is also known as the id, ego, and superego. And essentially, it's the three different sections of human morality and just the human personality. The id is the primal part of personality. It seeks satisfaction, mostly sexual or physical, which makes sense considering Freud put a lot of emphasis on infantile sexuality and just like sex in general. The ego, however, is the complete opposite. They're like yin and yang, where the ego is all ethics and morals. So the ego worries more about what other people think and how comfortable other people are, whereas the id relies on the primal desires. And the superego balances these two. Your superego is essentially the persona that you put out, that balances your id urges, your primal urges, and your ego or your ethical and moral urges. Freud had a lot of influences. He's incredibly popular. He's a household name. And he is known as one of the fathers of psychology. Some specific influences that Freud had on psychology are both his critics and the people he worked with. This includes two very, very popular, very, very well-known psychiatrists, Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. Carl Jung actually started as one of Freud's followers. Freud actually requested that Jung become the president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, because Freud and Carl Jung worked together and they had very similar ideas. Jung was an early supporter of Freud due to their shared interest in the unconscious, because psychoanalysis focuses on the unconscious, and Jung had his own ideas about the unconscious. However, after an irreconcilable split occurred in their friendship, Jung went off and researched his own ideas. This split occurred because Jung criticized Freud's idea on the infantile sexuality and the Oedipus complex, which Freud is infamous for his Oedipus complex. So after this irreconcilable split, Jung went on to concoct his own ideas about the unconscious, which created essentially the somewhat science of analyzing dreams and the collective unconscious, which the collective unconscious is essentially shared experiences of those in the same culture or same region that creates underlying thoughts and feelings that are shared by that group of people. So even though Jung was a critic and a friend of Freud at different points, he really helped boost psychology as we know it. One of Freud's other very, very well-known critics is Alfred Adler. Adler also started as one of Freud's friends or followers, I suppose you could say. But after irreconcilable disagreement, Alfred Adler and others left Freud's Vienna Circle, which his Vienna Circle was essentially just a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, and doctors that all followed kind of the Freudian beliefs. So after Freud and Adler split, Adler developed his own theories and his own thoughts that don't necessarily agree with Freud's theories. One of these is the individual psychology, and individual psychology sounds different than it actually is. When one hears the word individual, it might think that they're just looking at the singular person, but what it really means is that they're looking at the person as a whole and as a one big ecosystem of thoughts, essentially, which Freud kind of focused on individual parts whereas Adler focused on the whole being. So, despite Freud being highly contested, he had an unending effect on psychology. He's a household name today. He is well known for being both highly criticized and highly praised. He and his critics, such as Jung and Adler, have formed psychology into a science that helps millions and millions of people every day in perhaps known and unknown ways. And Freud is just one of the many scientists who will be remembered for years, centuries, decades, whatever be it, because of his influence and because of his forward thinking.